time to enjoy one of my favourite whiskies while talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. So in case anyone is not aware, I made a video a couple of years ago, short documentary about the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Now you can find out more about the entire history of that in the video, but essentially it was a large, failed, experimental overland expeditionary vehicle that was created as part of the United States Service Expedition that launched just before the war to basically reach the South Pole and stake a claim on Antarctica itself. It was a massive failure. The actual expedition itself was relatively successful, had to be cancelled before it was finished because of World War II, but the actual Antarctic Snow Cruiser didn't work. It was buried in the snow and it has since disappeared. Now, when I started making the script in the original video that came out a couple of years ago, there was very little information available online. There was a fantastic article by The Atlantic, which I still think is the best researched and best presented article on the Snow Cruiser. There was a few old magazine articles that I managed to dig up. There was a few old websites that I managed to access through, archive.org and various things like that. But that was about it, really. Since I've made my video, there has been a real explosion of interest in the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. And of course there was. There was back then, there is today. It's bizarre and it's unusual and it's fascinating in both the failure and the design and of course where it might be now. There are articles, podcasts, there are numerous videos beside mine that go into all sorts of these details. But what I will say is that since my video came out, there's not been a whole lot of new information. And what's more, there's a lot of unanswered questions, there's a lot of misconceptions, and there's a lot of debate back and forth about various aspects of the Snow Cruiser's design and ideas around why it failed or where it is now. And I get hundreds of comments per month on my videos, emailed to me, comments on various things that I do, that are in the vein of, what happened to it? Why was this design decision made and various things? And I thought what I would do is, well, basically collect them together. I've got 4 or 5 of the most commonly asked questions about the Snow Cruiser, and we'll answer them. Let's just answer them. I think hopefully I can shed some light on the most common questions that maybe I didn't fully cover in my first video. So for the purposes of this video, I've collected together 3 or 4 questions from people that have reached out to me that I think best surmise the questions that we're going to be discussing. And let's just pretend that they were delivered in an envelope like this. This is actually an original envelope with a stamp from the time. In fact, on the back here, registered number carried from Little America by the USS North Star. That was the ship that transported the Antarctic Snow Cruiser to Antarctica as part of the expedition. And it says the Snow Cruiser reaches the South Pole, which is a little bit presumptuous. Defense plans halted, Bird, Antarctic Expedition 3, also known as the United States Service Expedition, in South Pole regions, and Research Foundation of the Armour Institute of Technology. There's a lot of history to this, by the way. Postmarking and making up stamps, setting up postal stations was a very good way for governments basically to establish that they had territorial claims over a certain place. And as a result, these things were great keepsakes, very collectible, but they also served a slightly more ulterior motive, and they were a good way at reinforcing territorial claims. And that's why these things were found on a lot of Antarctic expeditions done by a lot of different companies. This one is dated Massachusetts, May 6, 3 p.m. In the 1941. So let's just say that the first question came via this lovely envelope. This question from J Hall 18. I don't understand why they chose to use wheels in the initial design, but that also in choosing them, they went for treadless tires. It seems such an obvious design flaw that was doomed to fail. Now, great question. And without a doubt, the most common question I get is, why wheels? Why on earth would they choose to use wheels rather than treads? And if they're using wheels, why would they go for these bizarre balloon tires that were completely treadless, essentially? Now, listen, I get a lot of comments from people who are like, well, if I was back there, I would have known exactly what to do and I would have told them. And I'm like, well, maybe you would. I don't know. But what I will say is there's 2 aspects to this answer or to understanding maybe why they went with this design. One of them is timescale, and the other one is scientific understanding of the time. Now, first of all, timescale. The Snow Cruiser was made on an incredibly tight timescale. It was made in 11 weeks, and while they had a huge budget, they were very much constrained by the fact that they had to get it shipped away from Boston Harbor down to Antarctica at a certain date. And what's more than that, they actually had dates in which they had to display the Snow Cruiser. Because remember, one of the big reasons for the Snow Cruiser, and all these lovely envelopes, beautiful articles like this in Popular Mechanics. These were part of propaganda. They were done to shoot up the kind of American domination of science and technology. And to be able to display this was going to basically help pay for what was this huge, very, very expensive overland machine. Now, on the topic of the treadless tyres, it's important to note that originally Thomas Poulter, who was the designer and the main designer and inventor of the Snow Cruiser, he had wanted to go for treaded tyres. He wanted to go for tyres that weren't completely perfectly smooth. There is this kind of claim that comes up a lot that the treadless tyres were used because the snow wouldn't stick to them as much. And that is contemporary. I've seen that in references in magazines and various things from the time. I don't know whether that is maybe a little bit of damage control, because basically they didn't have time to make their own molds for the tyres. And if you look at certain plans, and specifically a model that Dr. Thomas Poulter made, I don't know why I keep calling him Dr. Poulter made, you'll see that the tyres actually originally were designed to have treads in them, although how much difference that really would have made, I don't really know. The problem was they didn't have time to fulfill that vision, and what they ended up doing was reaching out to Goodyear, who could supply them with essentially molds for gigantic balloon tyres that were originally going to get used for a prospecting oil buggy that was used down in like Florida swamps. So that's the sort of main reason why those particular tyres were used. The other thing that's important to mention is this timescale problem seeped into everything. It meant that they couldn't obviously trial the vehicle, both on the roads or in the facilities, or go find snowy conditions somewhere, in America before they then shipped it off to Antarctica. They didn't have time to review the engines and the motor controls and the bizarre electric motors. Remember, all of this stuff was completely unique. Anything of this scale and size had been really made before, or for the kind of intended conditions that it was going into. So all of this stuff was very experimental, and there was no time to test any of it. It had to be out the door, out of the Pullman coachworks where it was made, on the road. It had to be then shown off all these locations, and then if they had time, loaded onto the North Star and taken down to Antarctica. So timescale was the real killer for this. And what's interesting is the Kharkovchanka, the Soviet iteration of an Antarctic snow cruiser, was made on a very similar timescale. And it's quite interesting when you compare the two. Both made on a similar timescale, one hugely successful based on the real experience that they had, and one that unfortunately was not, the Snow Cruiser. Now, the other big caveat that we have to always take into account when we're talking about this in anything in history is the scientific knowledge and technology of the time. Now, this is something that limited Poulter. The Snow Cruiser was in many ways ahead of its time, and if you know anything about, for example, Letourneau's snow trains, the overland trains that came out in the 1950s, they used a very similar sort of powertrain and also used gigantic big wheels and tyres, and also had problems but a lot more successes, and it's mainly because the technology had advanced for them to be able to do that. The other thing is, though, Poulter and his team that were designing this were the foremost experts on Antarctica really at that time. And what's more, they were definitely the foremost experts in the world on overland vehicular transport in Antarctica. It hadn't been done before. The people who had done it were Shackleton in 1904, 1908 perhaps. He took a Scottish-made car, actually, to the continent. I'm talking about a tiny, tiny little car. Mawson, an Australian explorer, had taken a plane. Scott had taken kind of tracked sledges, but that was about it, really. Now, in Little America 2, in the second iteration in the early 1930s, 1933, Poulter and his team, and of course we're talking about Admiral Byrd here, who's the real leader of these expeditions, they had taken the first larger vehicles to the continent. And you're talking about Ford and Citroen trucks that had been basically adapted into half-tracks. Now, they had had a lot of success with these, and that's where Poulter had the idea to develop something like the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. The other thing is that the whole track v wheel debate had come up at the time, but of course, because there wasn't many comparisons between how a gigantic balloon wheel and a wide track would perform in Antarctica, it was kind of anyone's guess which one would behave best. Now, I'm quoting here from Dr. Poulter's Antarctic Snow Cruiser, which is a research paper that was done in 1985, by far one of the most definitive and interesting articles and research papers that was ever done on the Antarctic Snow Cruiser, and they actually note the disagreements made at the time over tracks versus wheels. One of his companions, E.J. Pete Demas, in an interview recorded in 1979, claimed that he and Poulter had discussed designs for a mobile laboratory and reached contradictory conclusions. Poulter had favoured a wheeled vehicle with large pneumatic tyres. Demas had opted for a tracked vehicle because he believed this alone would provide the traction and flotation needed to cope with soft snow. He recalled experiences shared with Poulter of frequent mechanical failures of vehicles on the Second Bird expedition. In his view, Poulter had either forgotten them or chosen simply to be optimistic. Another aspect that might have influenced this is the fact that tracked technology of the time was somewhat in its infancy. I've recorded, like I say, 2 documentaries, one about the Snow Cruiser and one about the Kharkov-Chanka, and I often get, again, comparisons made between the two, which is fair. I make those comparisons as well, but a lot of people say, oh, well, the Soviets did it much better with their tracked technology, and it's true, but remember that the tracked vehicles were made in the 1950s after a World War arms race which developed tracked technology far beyond what they had access to in the early 1930s. In the 1930s, you were dealing with your sort of post-World War I designs of tanks. And the thing you have to remember is Poulter designed the Antarctic Snow Cruiser to be long enough and wide enough to cross huge Antarctic crevices, essentially. And his design was about 55 feet long, about 16 feet tall, and about 20 feet wide, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, keep that in mind, because the largest tank of the time, and well, still to this day in some ways, is I think the French, is it Char 2 or Char 2? I'm gonna get slammed for pronunciations again, but that thing is about maybe just over half the length. I can actually check. Char 2 heavy tank, 33 feet long, 9 foot wide, 13 foot tall. About half the size of what the Antarctic Snow Cruiser ended up. And what Poulter and his designers may have kind of realized is that they could either have something that was a bit smaller and tracked, or something that was larger that they suspected would be better served for crossing crevices and, you know, various things in Antarctica. Dean Freitag and Stephen Dibram, by the way, are the writers of Dr. Poulter's Antarctic Snow Cruiser, which, very catchy title, but it's probably the best and, like I mentioned before, most definitive look at the Snow Cruiser's design, history, genesis, and also its failings and why. And I just want to quote something here. It's quite long, but this maybe gives you a little bit of an explanation as to why Poulter maybe miscalculated so badly how the Antarctic Snow Cruiser would perform compared to how it actually did. Wheeled vehicles worked on ice but not snow, and there was no measurements or systematic observations to say why. Poulter had seen tracked vehicles running successfully on deep snow and could not see why suitably clad wheels large enough to distribute weight and minimise pressure over the surface should not work just as well. A later report noted that, on the level, by some oddity, the cruiser sank in snow up to 15 centimetres deep and then would not climb out over the curb of higher snow in front of its wheels. The coefficient of friction between the rubber tyres and the snow remained high enough to ensure that the wheels would not slip on undisturbed snow. However, the great weight of the vehicle was causing the wheels to sink deeply, so that the climb out was the equivalent to ascending a 20 to 30 degree slope. Power had to be expended to break the snow structure and climb the slope. Applied to the tyres, this overcame friction and caused the wheel slip, which only served to deepen the wheel ruts. Simple calculations suggest that for the tyres available, the Snow Cruiser was too heavy by a factor of 3 to 5. Even with dual wheels, the load per tyre for the vehicle itself would have been too great. A cruiser built to aircraft rather than railcar designs might have travelled further. This, to me, is the best description on why the wheels failed, why the design didn't work, but also highlights, like I say, that real gulf of information that was missing in Antarctic research. But of course, all of the failures and all of these observations made with things like the Antarctic Snow Cruiser is what led us to understanding it better and then to basically overcome those problems in later vehicles and designs. Now we'll dive back into the lovely letter and see what our next question is. And it comes from Barney, who says, I've always wanted to know what happened to the plane that was intended to be used with the Snow Cruiser. Was it abandoned too? Now, this is a great question, and it's something that I just completely did not cover in the video. The Snow Cruiser was meant to be equipped with a Beechcraft Model 17 stagger wing. that's correct. And how it worked was it was to be attached to the top of the cruiser, and it could be dismounted and used as a scout vehicle. There was a crane on the cruiser that could lift it and take it off. The crane could also be used to change the wheels and various things. And of course, in a lot of the promotional material for it, it was looked at as the kind of scout vehicle. It could go ahead, range ahead, scout things out, and then it could feed back to the cruiser. Of course, that never worked because the cruiser now got further than, a few miles. However, the aircraft was a huge success. Now, the Beechcraft, I don't know much about aviation, but the Beechcraft has always been recognized, I think, as one of the best of their class. They were known to be really good flyers, very comfortable aircraft, and it was used through that entire season for a lot of exploratory flights. It was used for surveying, scientific research, transportation, you name it. And what's more, it was evacuated in 1942, I believe, when the base was evacuated as part of World War II. It was loaded back onto the North Star that had taken it and the snow cruiser over, and it was taken back to America, basically to be refurbished and then sold on. And of course, the poor Antarctic Snow Cruiser was just abandoned and left behind. Now, the story of when the Beechcraft, the Staggerwing, returned to America, or returned from Antarctica, I think is more fascinating. And I only found this out after I had made the video fully. Essentially, after it came back, it was given a service, it was done up, and then it was bought by an Australian entrepreneur called Eddie Connellan. Now, he was looking for a Staggerwing that he could use as part of his kind of outback aviation services, essentially. But after purchasing the Staggerwing, transporting it all the way over to Australia in 1942, it was seized. It was seized by the Australian government, who wanted to basically use it as part of the war effort. So he went to all this trouble, I think it was 12 or 16,000 US dollars that he paid for it, transported all the way over, and then it was basically seized instantly by the Australian government. Now, they transferred that over to the Australian Air Wing, and it was basically turned into a transport aircraft, VIP aircraft. It was repainted, recommissioned, and it was used basically by a communications unit for transporting VIPs. And also, apparently, it was used for target practice by the anti-aircraft batteries. I don't think they were actually shooting at it, but yeah, apparently it was used as target practice as well too. Now, by the end of the war, she was in a pretty poor state. She had been used up. Engines were in an absolutely terrible state. She was full of holes as well too. And in a somewhat cheeky move, the Australian government offered it back to Eddie. I don't know if they, compensated him for basically taking his plane and then ruining it and then giving it back to him. But he spent then years getting it back online, re-engineering it, getting it all done back up, patching all the holes in it and various things like that. But by 1956 or 1957, he listed it for sale. It was then transferred to another company who took out the kind of rear passenger seats and the passenger seats and various things and put in a hopper. Now, the hopper was for storing seeds, and it was basically turned into a seeding plane. It would fly over the crops, it would drop the seeds out, and it could use for seeding thousands and thousands of miles of land. Now, after that, I believe in the 1960s or 1963, it crashed. It was heavily damaged. I believe it was also damaged in a fire at some point as well too. But amazingly, it's still around. And since 2007, a couple have been basically restoring it in New Zealand. Now, they actually reached out to me. They sent me a whole bunch of information. They have an absolutely amazing Facebook page, which you can go and visit. And since, I think, 2014-15, I forget how far back their posts go, they have been posting photos with the history of it, photos of it in Antarctica, then in its sort of Australian Army livery when it was part of the Air Force, then in the as a crop duster or crop seeder, I guess, and now as they painstakingly recommission it and bring it back online, it is looking absolutely gorgeous. And it looks like they have quite a few of these Staggerwings or Beechcraft, and they've been doing them up in different ways. I think they have quite a history out there as being quite reliable kind of outback and bushcraft in Australia and New Zealand and stuff like that. Either way, well worth going to their Facebook page. Absolutely incredible history. My dream one day is that I could possibly get out there and actually see it in person. A direct link back to the past, back to the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. It's absolutely amazing. And it's something I wish I'd put into the video. I think that's the story people need to know about. Maybe I'll make a a video all about that at some point in the future. Like I say, I'm not an aviation expert, I'm not an expert in anything, but I don't really know much about Beechcraft stagger wings, but they are beautiful planes. It was a gorgeous plane, and the fact that it's still around after all these years, just absolutely incredible. So we'll go back to the letter, consult our letter for another question. And this one comes from Derek16, who says, Callum, you mentioned in your video the possible whereabouts of the Snow Cruiser. Has there been any update to this? So yeah, in my original documentary, I sort of tried to figure out where the original Snow Cruiser might be, or I did to a very brief degree. Essentially, in the 1960s, the USS Edisto, which was an army icebreaker, spotted an iceberg. Now, I'm saying an iceberg. When you think of that, you think of like, you know, a little cartoon iceberg. You're talking about gigantic cliffs that have basically snapped off from the Antarctic shelf, the main Antarctic continent, and then float out to sea. Now, in this gigantic floating shelf, you could see basically a cross-section of an old, you know, base that had been snapped in half and then drifted out. It obviously been covered up decades previously. We think that this was probably Little America 3. There wasn't anything really to confirm it, but based on the location of where it was and the kind of drifting of the time and various things, it was probably Little America 3. Now, something that comes up quite a lot is people say, oh, well, the Snow Cruiser was in there, it was spotted in there, or somebody spotted an iceberg floating out to sea. Nobody spotted the Snow Cruiser. The Snow Cruiser had last been sighted, I think, in the 1950s by a British expedition before anything had snapped off. We think, though, if of course that is Little America 3, that the Snow Cruiser must be somewhere in there. Now, beyond that, it's very hard to tell what it is, but what we can say is it's probably at the bottom of the sea. There's almost no way that it's not right now sitting at the bottom of the Southern Sea, where the Little America 3 was a constantly moving ice floe and glacier, essentially. So over time, it would have just snapped off and melted and fallen down there. What's interesting is, a few months after I made my video, I was contacted by a gentleman called Clarence Novak. Now, him and his friend had done a research study in 2011, and they had basically tried to estimate where the Snow Cruiser could be. It's a fascinating article. I would recommend that you actually read the entire article from start to finish, and they explain it in terms of ice flows. Of course, you can calculate where a lot of the ice flows are coming based on movement and satellite photos and various things like that. But it essentially breaks down to this idea that the USS Edisto, when it spotted that iceberg, it was seeing Little America 3, but the part that contained the Snow Cruiser had actually broken off earlier. And what had happened was when the icebergs break off and they essentially drift westward. And as they're drifting westward, they're moving along the sort of cliff line of these gigantic Arctic shelves, and they are being, you know, battered and broken and eventually broke down into nothing. And as a result, the Snow Cruiser was basically worn away and then sunk to the bottom of the sea, somewhere along that sort of cliff line where it broke off. Now, if I quote the actual research paper itself, the whole thing's well worth reading, but the abstract states, satellite observations of more recent calving events show that small icebergs from the Bay of Whales area drift westward and repeatedly impact the shelf, fragmenting as they move. This implies that a number of artifacts from the bases, such as the 1939 to 1941 Snow Cruiser, are likely strewn across the seabed near the 1962 ice front position. So that means that, of course, as the iceberg was breaking off and moving along this cliff, it was chipping off and breaking away. The various artifacts, including the Snow Cruiser, probably then sank down to basically the edge of the ice shelf where it was in 1961, which of course we can work out. Now, does that mean we can find the Snow Cruiser? Well, Clarence certainly felt that they could, and I personally think, yes, it's possible to find anything, given the money, given the time, given the budget, you know, all this stuff. We need to work out, obviously, where the 1961, whatever, ice shelf is. We can do that. We need to make sure that the ice is actually at a point in which we can get a ship there to search for it. And of course, the big thing, obviously, you need budget. You need people who can look for this. If anything, it might probably just turn up by accident. Somebody might discover it in a survey or something like that. It wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened. In 2012, I believe, they found the Terra Nova. The Terra Nova was the ship that took Scott on his ill-fated attempt to the South Pole. It was discovered somewhere off Greenland. It was sunk in 1943 during World War II. I think it hit an iceberg. and they managed to discover it. Now, similar sorts of conditions. You're talking about a shipwreck from the 1940s through to the 60s, lying at the seabed. Obviously, you're talking about completely different poles of the Earth, but it wouldn't be the first time that, you know, Antarctic artifacts have turned up. And oh, if you're doing an expedition, if you need a photographer, a documentarian, hey, I used to work at sea. If you need a cook, you know me. I wasn't a great cook, but I can do the cooking. Get me on that expedition. Let's do it. Let's get it out there. This is the great thing about all this extra attention on the Snow Cruiser. Maybe there's some rich millionaire out there who's right now going, yeah, I'm going to find the Snow Cruiser. There's a million different warships out there that people are trying to find. There's all these. Somebody needs to find the Snow Cruiser. That's the interesting one. That's what everyone wants to find. Get me on that expedition, please. And the final question from our little envelope comes from Jeremy, who says, how do you feel about the other videos and articles that have been made since you published yours? And I think it's a really good question because, you know, the main reason I made this video all the way back then was one, obviously to show off what was quite an interesting, you know, historical tidbit that I thought a lot of people didn't know about. And I was right, I think, because I don't think a lot of people were aware of this. That's a lot of the comments that I get. And since then, it has raised attention for it. And that was my other thing, is I was kind of hoping that I could raise attention and find more information about it. One of the main reasons I like making my videos is every time I make them, people reach out to me with information that they have. I've had people contact me whose family and relatives worked on the Snow Cruiser project and sent me photos. Clarence Novak and the folks who are repairing the beach wing. All of these people reached out as a result of me kind of putting that video online, and that's really what I love to do. What I will say is a lot of the information that I made in my video hasn't really been expanded on that much, which is a bit of a shame. I was hoping that, you know, somebody would come out with another academic paper or a book would be written or more, you know, YouTube videos and documentaries. The ones that have come out and the articles that have come out are often just republishing a lot of the same materials that I came up with. And, you know, this isn't to criticize that, but, you know, a lot of the stuff I've talked about in this video hasn't really been discussed in all the videos and all the articles since. And all of this information is available online. These are, you know, articles that, you know, obviously you've got to purchase them. They're academic articles and you've got to track them down and find your sources. You've got to stalk eBay to find different old magazines and articles and stuff, but it can be done. I'd hope that in the future, again, more information and more things come out about the Snow Cruiser. It would be good if some new information could come out. I'm always trying to find new information about these things. And right now, you know, a lot of it's being shared, but it'd be quite good, like I say, if there was like a new trove of documents that were dug up, or somebody manages to go to the old Armour Institute of Technology and find the original plans, or somebody does manage to start, you know, funding an expedition to actually go search for this thing down in Antarctica. That's what I'd really like to see. Now, I think that's it though. There was, like I say, those I hope are answers to questions that a lot of people ask primarily. Tends to be around the design, tends to be around where it might be now, tends to be around things like the airplane and that sort of thing. If you have more questions about the Antarctic Snow Cruiser, please do leave them down in the comments below. I don't want to keep coming back to the subject, you know, I don't want to turn my channel into the Antarctic Snow Cruiser channel. That's always been something I've been very worried of when it comes to YouTube videos. You don't want to get stuck in a niche, but it's a really fascinating subject, and it's something that I've been meaning to follow up with for a long time. A lot of people have been reaching out to me, and every time I do, I'm always like, listen, I'm going to try and make a follow-up video, and I thought I'd make one that's a little bit more informal, a bit like this. So hope that's worked out. But anyway, I'm going to get back to researching the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.